My name's Regina Scheyvens, and it's my pleasure to be here from New Zealand, Massey University, and I'll be presenting some research that I've been doing in the South Pacific Islands. So I'm going to take you on a trip to the other side of the world and show you a few images and show you a number of quotations from people that we have been interviewing in the past 2 years during the pandemic, people who usually rely heavily on tourism income and whose borders have been closed until recently. In fact, some of the Pacific Islands are still closed to international travel. So it's a really interesting time, heavily dependent on tourism, as are many tourism islands, the Balearic Islands among them, and they are thinking about what they want from the future. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some ideas on culture, employee well-being and work. And my apologies that I can't speak to you in Spanish.
Don't worry.
Okay, so I really like this cartoon. I think it's summing up a lot of concerns. Alba Sud is a group that is interested in tourism activism and is interested in local residents, employees, etc., having their rights upheld and not tourists taking over destinations. But in the Pacific, Hawaii is the only place where you've seen any movement against tourism. And there were a couple of things happening prior to the pandemic from Indigenous Hawaiians who are Polynesian and are connected to many other Polynesian peoples across the Pacific, including the Māori people of New Zealand. They have for a long time felt quite exploited by the tourism sector with the wages and with the living conditions in places like Waikiki for workers compared to tourists, and the high cost of living and the sexualisation of things like the hula dance, which was traditionally something that was performed for the gods with a more cultural meaning and significance, and then concerns about the health of a vulnerable population as well, which is the same for many of the Pacific Islands, which is why they left their borders closed for so long. Most of them do not have are not high income countries, and they don't have good healthcare systems. So Hawaii's the most developed in that sense, but the others have other forms of development which are very strong. And you're going to see a lot of positive stories coming out of my presentation about how people survived in relation to the pandemic. Okay, so since May 2020, I have done research with Dr. Api Magono. I'll put a picture of him on another slide to make sure I didn't forget to mention him, and some others that asked how have the people responded to the pandemic in the Pacific, and how could more sustainable, self-determined forms of tourism be developed post-pandemic. So really thinking about how do people determine their own futures. Here's Api. He wanted to come to Europe, but our university is still making it very difficult for us to travel, and he decided to go for the first time back to the Pacific Islands then instead. So we were not able to travel for most of this time to conduct research face-to-face, which we would have normally done. And instead, and so you see New Zealand down there, Australia obviously, the islands we've done our research in mainly are highlighted. Most of them they're 3 to 4 hours flight from New Zealand, just so you understand. And there is, most tourists arrive by flights, except in Vanuatu, because it's a little closer to Australia and the cruise companies, those who are interested in cruise tourism, they leave from places like Sydney and Brisbane, and they're New Caledonia and Vanuatu are only 2 days sailing away, so you can get a 7-day package and go stop in 5 or 6 different ports across those countries, so they get most of the cruise tourism. But of course, cruises were on hold until recently. They've just started up again. So we worked with in-country researchers, and we communicated with them on Zoom, and we relied on them to administer some of our surveys face-to-face, as well as all of the interviews with community members. But Api and I did some interviews with tourism industry officials, government officials, and others online. In our first survey, which was online only, we basically found out that 73% of people who responded to the survey had suffered from a major decline in household earnings, which we didn't think was surprising. So we always targeted tourism-dependent communities in these countries. So just to give you an idea of how tough it was, but also you saw 4 countries highlighted previously. Only one of them had a wage subsidy. Spain had a wage subsidy, New Zealand had wage subsidies, so did Cook Islands because of its relationship with New Zealand. But Fiji, Vanuatu and Samoa, no wage subsidies. Some business support. Most people had to find other ways to get by. They were allowed to withdraw their retirement savings, but that's a problem too for their long-time security. So I just have 3 slides on how they've adapted, because that's not my major focus. I'm going to move on to looking at people's well-being, which we try to measure. And then I will be talking about, so especially employees' well-being during the pandemic period. Then I'll be talking about people's aspirations, their hopes for future tourism. So the stories of adaptation are incredibly positive on the whole. They had to adapt because they didn't have wage subsidies. But they have a strong customary land system. And the countries I mentioned, over 80% of the land is not freehold land or government land. It is held by communities. They own it. It makes it difficult for them to get loans from the bank. It can't be used as collateral, but it means that so many people could return to their vanua, their traditional lands during these tough times, or go fishing. And more fish species returned. People in coastal areas where there's a lot of tourism normally said they thought that without the lights from the resorts, the lighting, as well as the sunscreen from the tourists, as well as just more bodies in the water, many more fish species returned, and fishing was better. But definitely lots of people returned to their home villages and went back to cultivating the land. People also went back to bartering. Traditional form of exchange. I remember being a young high school student and studying economics for the first time and finding out that barter is what they did back in the Stone Ages, right? Well, barter is a system that we know can work informally in many societies and be effective. And we may see this as another post-capitalist form of economic development and indeed progress. Amazingly sophisticated forms of bartering went on around the Pacific. Every country had their own site. So this is an article from The Guardian, obviously, giving one example in the headline. Someone trades a kayak for 2 piglets from somebody else's house. So that's great. Someone can grow the pigs, someone else can go fishing maybe. But other people they were using social media, so Facebook sites. This was barter for a bit of Fiji, but Samoa, Tonga, they all had their own sites, which facilitated the exchange even during lockdown periods. They were able to, for example, if somebody was a maths teacher, they might offer tutoring in exchange for someone else providing them with pineapples. So there were all sorts of exchanges happening, and it was really effective for lots of people. There was a notable rise in communal labour and gifting. So people would come together, like the young men of a community might come together and cultivate gardens for the older people near to the elderly people's homes, the people who couldn't go up into the bush and clear some land to grow their own vegetables. So they would help them out with that. They had systems for sharing some of the surplus of the fish and the garden produce. They would obviously try to sell some as well when they started growing more. But they also really looked after their neighbours more. And this was often based on traditional cultural systems that were well known but had grown out of favour. In Fiji, there's something called solisoli, which is when you do come together with others to offer your labour and time with no expectation of any monetary return. So, focus on impacts on people's well-being. Api and I decided that we needed to understand quantitatively and qualitatively what was going on, because we were excited to see how well some people had adapted. It was hard without the cash income, but they were doing remarkably well, and nearly everybody in interviews said something like, there's a silver lining to the dark clouds of the pandemic. There's some positive things that have come out of this. Someone said to us, in fact, 2 weeks ago, this was actually a Māori tourism provider in New Zealand, so the Indigenous people of New Zealand. This tourism provider said, are you allowed to thank the pandemic? I really want to thank the pandemic. It's made us rethink completely what we're doing, and we're able to do more now for our own rangatahi, our young people. Anyway, we knew there were good things happening, so we thought, how do we show anyone else? We want to make sure our research is not only impacting on, not only read by other scholars, we want policymakers, government officials, industry people to read our work. So we've been writing more blogs than we didn't used to do anything like that. Lots of short pieces for the conversation. Do media interviews whenever they're interested, just because we want to get the word out about, because there are not strong social movements already within the Pacific, we want to find a way of sharing some of what we're finding. But we knew we needed some solid data to convince some of them that there had been positives during the pandemic. So anyway, first we developed a framework of well-being, Frangipani framework, and in the first version had social, spiritual, mental, physical and financial dimensions. But we then realised we hadn't thought of the environmental context within which well-being is situated. So then we brought in, we needed to bring in environmental well-being, and so we thought, okay, well, the frangipani only has 5 petals. We can't artificially create another one. So we decided, right, we'll make it environmental context as the tree, and then we've got the individual flowers on the tree. This is actually quite useful, because Api and I are thinking about resilience of communities going forward, and we know the pandemic is one shock, but these communities in the South Pacific, they're some of the most vulnerable to climate change, right? So climate change related shocks, the huge cyclones they've had in recent years, for example, and flooding and inundation of seawater. But also there have been plenty of political crises and coups in the Pacific. There have also been other health crises, as we know, like SARS. There have also been the global financial crisis, the Asian economic crisis before that. All of these things cause shocks to tourism-reliant communities. So we wanted to look at resilience. So we quite like the idea of the frangipani tree with the individual frangipanis with the different dimensions of well-being that people told us were important to them. But we wanted to also look at, like I said, at that environmental context. So the roots and the roots and the trunk are the environmental context, because the conditions there, whether there's enough water, whether also there's strong winds, all of these things will impact on those flowers on the tree. So that's just to explain that. Anyway, so what we did is we did one survey of well-being prior to these countries opening up their borders to international tourists. Okay, there had been Fiji and Cook Islands had a brief opening during 2021 and closed quickly again, but then they were planning their major openings for end of 2021, beginning of 2022. So this is just before that we collected this data. Now, I know it's a bit small, so I'll explain here. This is mental well-being. The darker colours, sorry, I keep getting it's interactive. The darker colours are strongly agree. Here's the statement. They had the questions, has your well-being improved during the period of COVID-19? We asked them to think back to March 2020. Over that whole period, had their well-being improved? Mental well-being, over 40% said it had strongly improved. So that's during all this financial stress, still their mental well-being significantly improved. Add on the others saying yes, it had definitely improved. A vast majority. Let's go to the strongest one of all those, their spiritual well-being. A lot of the Pacific is highly Christian. There are some other denominations that are strong in countries like Fiji, where there's also a good number of Muslim and Hindu people, but Christianity is the dominant religion, and people said we've had time to remember what's important to us and to deal with our spiritual lives, and that's been really valuable. Also, next thing, social well-being. People have loved the chance to spend time with their women working in the tourism sector, talking about time with their children. Time to look after them and to cook them the meals they used to and to help them with their homework and to look out for their neighbours. People saying it's great how we all took care of each other and shared. Even if I didn't have much to give, I would always find something to give to my neighbour and they might be more generous with me. Next time round it might be my turn to, I have more to share. We just heard great stories. So physical well-being, or environmental well-being, they thought the environment was cleaner and better without tourists, and so that improved.
So just a question on the social well-being. Were there lockdown measures as well? Like, were people closed into their homes as in other parts of the world?
Yeah, great question. Yes, for periods of time, but they weren't that long. But definitely they weren't allowed to move out of their villages for periods of time, but they could check in on their neighbours and do things in their communities. They weren't allowed to attend normal services at churches and things like that. There were limits on gatherings, but they still could connect. And they couldn't move between villages and towns and things like that for some periods of time. So yes, there were restrictions on movement within the countries too, as well as closing their borders for long periods of time. And physical well-being improved for many people, not for all. It was more mixed, but for some it definitely did because they were getting out, being more active on the land, on the sea, fishing. Financial well-being, by the time we did the survey, it wasn't as, we thought most people were going to say they strongly disagreed that it improved, but there was mixed results. So some people had found that they were doing okay now, and some people had started businesses like a guy Ben used to be a chef at one of the 5-star resorts, and he started Ben's Kitchen, an online site where people could order catering, order meals, and he got a lot of orders from the Fijian diaspora living all around the world who would order meals for their to be delivered to their families, like for Father's Day or Mother's Day or special events. And he's loving running his own business, for example. So I've just got a few slides. I won't be able to talk to them all, but I'll go through these more quickly, showing what some of our participants said. But on financial well-being, we've been able to engage ourselves into using our surrounding natural resources for daily consuming and then selling farm produce when we can. Physical well-being. I've lost a lot of weight from not working in the tourism industry. Before I used to eat fast food from work, and now there's a lot more exercise. So people walking to their gardens, people doing activities and having time for that. Mental well-being. After being let go from work, I suffered greatly, but things are much better now. I'm at peace knowing everything here. A number of people said to us, I'm at peace now. I'm at peace working the land. I'm out fishing on the sea. I'm at peace in this environment. The hotel is not the solution to our problems. We need to be kind, look after ourselves and each other. And this is what I learned, that COVID has been positive for my well-being. Social well-being. A lot of family time is spent together now, resting and being together in our family. I'm much closer to my children than before, when I was always working. Spiritual well-being. There are 9 of us in the family and all work in tourism. When the pandemic hit, we had all these people at home and not earning. This put a lot of pressure on us to feed people, but more difficult is encouraging them to be strong. This is where our faith came in and helped us stay positive and survive. They found solace in seeking God at a tough time. Environmental well-being. This person's talking about the return of certain fish species, turtles, bait fish, since there are no tourists and floodlights in the lagoon. And also, there are no tourists disturbing our view. People actually said in the Cook Islands at first, where they have the most tourists, Rarotonga gets 14 times as many tourists as there are local residents. So it's a little bit like Bacelona possibly in terms of the numbers versus the residents. But one person said to us back in 2020, we looked at the beaches at first and were like, oh my gosh, they're empty. What are we without these people, without the tourists? But now we see our own families on the beaches, enjoying their time there, having some leisure or fishing, and it's really good. So I think I'm being a bit slow, so I'll go faster, but because I've got a couple of more things to say. But basically there was an interconnection of well-beings. People's mental health, their physical and social well-being and spiritual well-being were very much connected. What do employees want from the future, though, of tourism then? Okay, not surprising, tourism employees everywhere, right? Decent work, Raoul. But job security, better wages, working conditions and income protection. Income protection just doesn't exist at all, and they feel that a lot of the businesses just wanted to let them go as quickly as possible when the pandemic struck. Many people I've talked to in Fiji are on casual or temporary contracts, like monthly contracts. I interviewed a receptionist once at a resort who said, I don't know if I'll be working next month. I have to look at the schedule. Every month I have to look at the schedule to see if I still have a job, if I can still feed my kids or pay their school fees. And so these are often highly skilled people still that are in those vulnerable positions. The expatriate workers, they usually have secure contracts. But the local employees make up the majority of the employees, and they want better conditions. They want balance. As one Fijian elder said, as I was telling Carla earlier, tourism must complement our way of life. That's what we want. We don't necessarily want to go full on back to that busy, dollar-driven life, because we've found other things that matter. They want more training, they want more upskilling, not just in how to clean a room more quickly, but in things like the transferable skills like IT, so they can do something and decide for themselves if they want to move out of tourism or if there's a crisis that hits the tourism sector. They want more support for micro-enterprises. Api and I think that actually there's a great deal of entrepreneurial spirit and expertise in the Pacific, but many Indigenous people in Pacific countries feel that if they ever try to run a business, people expect them to fail because they are more communal. They often, are sharing the wealth, not just looking at accumulating dollars in their own bank accounts. People assume they're going to fail and they don't get the wraparound support that's needed to really help out. And many people survived the pandemic by setting up micro-enterprises like baking cakes for birthday parties, catering and things. So they'd like to know how they can develop those. They'd also like there to be more locally owned businesses. In Cook Islands, there is a law that you have to, if I want to invest in a tourism property there, I could only ever own 49% of the shares, right? Majority shareholding must be in Cook Islander hands. It's a great way of those joint ventures encouraging more local ownership and control over tourism. Fiji, Vanuatu, Samoa don't have that, and so it can be quite hard to find a lot of locally owned businesses, and sometimes they're the smaller ones. And in the case of something like cruise tourism, a number of local operators in Vanuatu just were so frustrated. They ran great tours, but they couldn't get the agent to list them on the cruise ships. They were never seen as good enough. They could never capture any of that market, and they just feel like they get looked past all the time. Shared ownership models for large enterprises is what they'd like, and less burden on the over-touristed areas, spread the benefits. Find ways of promoting off-season tourism. And a short way of saying it, in Auckland they're trying to do this thing of trying to be, this is New Zealand obviously, a great place to live, a great place to work, and a great place to visit. Okay, all I want to say is live comes first, work comes second, and visit comes third. Okay? So I think maybe for all of us with our cities and our planning and thinking about that, there's nothing wrong with having visitors. But we can't overlook the well-being of the people who live in the places and who work there. This is our website where we put all of our findings related to this research. It's called reimaginingsouthpacifictourism.com. And so we just try to share it as quickly as possible. That's the short blogs as well as longer pieces and some other information. And again, my apologies that I couldn't speak to you in Spanish. If you want to follow up with questions later, after I'm only here at the Alba Sud Summer School for today. But I'd be very happy to have anybody email me. I'm easy to find. You just look up Regina Massey. I'm the only one, and so you don't have to spell my surname, okay? Which I have from my Dutch father. Okay, so muchas gracias.